On May 16th, 2012, Brian Jacob Church learned about Homan Square the hard way. In his first tell-all radio interview, Brian joins us tonight on the Free Thought Project and the Bob Tuskin Show to talk about this nightmarish ordeal. He says officers cuffed him to a bench for an estimated 17 hours, intermittently interrogating him without reading his Miranda rights to remain silent. It would take another 3 hours and an unusual lawyer visit through a wire cage before he was finally charged with terrorism-related offenses at the nearby 11th District Station, where he was made to sign papers, fingerprinted, and photographed. His case later was dubbed the NATO 3. And of course, this was the first charge of terrorism in the state of Chicago, a state riddled with police corruption. Without further ado, I welcome Brian Jacob Church to the show. Brian, I first want to tell you that I admire your courage. You are an incredibly brave whistleblower, and my hat goes off to you, my friend, for experiencing all that you did and still having the wherewithal and the courage, like I said, to come out and tell your story. Can you tell me what happened leading up to your arrest, and then, of course, walk me through your experience at Homan Square?
All right. So the night we got arrested, we were, hanging out and stuff. And we were hanging out with these two people who claimed to be actors themselves, but turned out to be officers. This night, they had brought up some ideas to Molotov cocktails, and according to our political philosophy, we as, I consider myself to be an anarchist. We don't feel justified in, holding ourselves over authority over other people. So essentially, we told them, like, hey, looking like we're not comfortable with what's going on, but, I mean, you're your own person, you're a human being. As long as you don't get hurt, do whatever you do. So later that night, we were waited in, typical team military style fashion. And we were placed against the wall with our handcuffs on our back. We tried to ask them, if they could use a warrant or if they could tell us what was going on, and of course we didn't get no answers, besides shut the hell up and stuff like that. So it was maybe 11:30, 12 o'clock at night, when they took us all to their unmarked police vehicles and they brought us to this facility we now know as Homan Square. Once we arrived at Homan Square, they drove us to one of the last garage doors on the building. If you're facing the building, it's the right-hand side. You actually, in a lot of the pictures that you see behind there, you can see some of the garage doors that are there. So they took us to this last garage door, and they brought us in to this big parking garage style warehouse, where they took pictures of us. And, I mean, this is my first time really being arrested. I've been arrested before, but that's another story. So when they brought us in and took pictures of us, I thought that, they were going to book us properly. I mean, from the types of military vehicles that I saw in the garage, I knew this wasn't a regular facility, but I still thought that, for some reason that they would still follow the laws. It was the officer who drove me to the facility actually told me that the pictures that they were taking were not actually going to be for booking purposes, but rather they were going to use these pictures for facial recognition, and the pictures were going to go into an FBI database.
They actually told you that?
Yes. So when he told me this, it was at this point that I realized that no, this was actually not a typical police facility, and this was not, a typical arrest or harassment, just, trying to scare the protesters away. So then the officer brought us up to these interrogation cells that we had to go to, and he led us into these interrogation cells. And so as I was walking through the building, I took in my surroundings. It was a pretty nondescript cinder block, painted white and gray type building. And so we took a right, and as I looked down this hallway that we were going into, I saw doors, 8 solid steel doors with folders taped on them. I didn't understand what the folders were there for until I was actually placed into one of these interrogation cells. These folders are there to actually make it so that you can't actually see outside of the cell, because there's a little window there. When the officer brought me into the cell, he took my left hand and he handcuffed it to the bench. But when he handcuffed me to the bench, he saw that I had the number to the National Lawyers Guild written on my arm. He recognized the number and said to me, "Oh, what phone number is that?" And before I could answer, he said, "Oh, that's the National Lawyers Guild." And there was another officer standing with him, and they just started laughing about it, of course. And so when he said that, I was I said to him, "Yeah, that's the National Lawyers Guild number, and I would like to make a phone call." It was then that the officer who handcuffed me to the bench told me that no, I would not be able to make any phone calls from this facility, and I wouldn't be going anywhere or talking to anybody for some time. It was at this point where I realized, okay, this is a little bit more serious than not only did I initially think, but even after coming through the garage and seeing all those vehicles and, the FBI database with the pictures and stuff, I realized, okay, this is something a lot more serious than just some, typical stuff that they try to pull with people.
Wow.
The first thing that came to my mind was the National Defense Authorization Act of 2012, which I'm sure as you and your listeners know, the National Defense Authorization Act has a certain provision written inside. It's maybe a paragraph or two that details about how police and military can arrest and indefinitely detain American citizens without actually charging them or granting them access to an attorney or even going to court and trial and stuff like that. And it's an indefinite detention, and the language used in this provision, it says indefinite detention until end of terrorist hostilities. So, I've done some research, and typically when somebody makes a lot of noise and they don't agree with our government, they tend to set them up or, charge them with terrorism or even go as far as assassinating that person, like they did with Fred Hampton and Malcolm X. So, as I'm sitting in this place, handcuffed to a bench, I'm thinking to myself, okay, we just got black back. We're never going to get out of here. So I was sitting on the bench. I tried to go to sleep or whatever. It was very uncomfortable because they wouldn't unhandcuff me, and my ankles were shackled together. And nobody knew I was there, and so I was a little bit stressed out. But then they came in and they started like asking me questions. They started trying to interrogate me about like my political philosophy and the kinds of people that I hang out with and where I'm from, why I was in Chicago and stuff like that. Because they wouldn't allow me to have access to a lawyer, I didn't answer any of their questions. And, you know, I mean, like, I even went as far as when they asked my name, I told them it was Donald Duck, you know?
Yeah, I think I've heard of you before, Donald.
I'm quite well known. But yeah, so they seemed a little disappointed and frustrated that I wouldn't answer their questions. But I was fortunate enough that they restrained themselves from, you know, trying to practice what they term enhanced interrogation, which is shit. It's torture.
Right.
You know, somebody asked me if the practices that they used with me in Homan Square was seemed like it was pretty typical for them. And I mean, I've thought about it, and you know what? The way they treated me, I feel personally, was not typical of the kind of treatment that people face in there, because they actually never put their hands on me. I felt like they wanted to, but I was fortunate enough to not be subject to that kind of treatment. You know, they tried to interrogate me one more time, and again, I wouldn't answer their questions because I didn't have an attorney. So finally, from what my attorney said, it was about 17 hours later, they actually managed to find me because they had called some really high-up people within the mayor's office, you know, his little cabinet of people that he keeps. And because we weren't in any system, like there was no records of our arrest, and actually CPD told my attorneys that there were no records of anyone being arrested that night, and they knew nothing of the raid or anything. The person in the mayor's office told them to check out Homan Square because it sounds pretty typical for individuals who actually are placed in this facility. So they finally come find me, and as two people, I don't know who they were. They didn't really introduce themselves. As they were trying to interrogate me, another officer came in and told them that my attorneys were here and that they were demanding to see me. So he uncuffed me from the bench, cuffed me back up, and walked me to this little cage they have in this back room, where I was actually able to speak to one of my attorneys through the fence. When I went back to the cell, the two people who were trying to interrogate me the second time were gone, and I had never heard anything from them again. And about 3 hours after I talked to my attorney, then we were finally taken to an actual real police station and then booked and charged, which is when they finally charged us with conspiracy and material support for terrorism and a whole bunch of, arson and terrorism-related charges, including possession of explosive devices.
What was the actual charge?
So we had about 11 charges. One charge was conspiracy to commit terrorism. We had material support for terrorism. We had conspiracy to commit arson and material support for arson. We had possession of an incendiary device with intent to commit arson, possession of an incendiary device with knowledge that another had intent to commit arson, possession of an incendiary device with intent to commit terrorism, possession of an incendiary device with knowledge that another had intent to commit terrorism, and 2 charges of unlawful use of a weapon. Oh, and 1 charge of solicitation to commit arson.
There's lots of speculation that as high up as Rahm Emanuel's office was utilizing this to make an example, to have that terrorism card played. What's your intuition on that?
Well, I definitely think so. I mean, Rahm Emanuel got a lot of money in defense funds, and you know, typical to a politician, a lot of that money went into his pocket. However, he needed something to show for, you know, having all that money spent. You know, I figured, you know, since me and my 2 co-defendants were the first ones to Chicago from out of state, they told these undercover police officers that we were the ones that they wanted. And so I feel like Emanuel and, you know, Anita Alvarez and the rest of them decided to try and make an example out of us to, you know, try and scare people away from protesting.
Do you think that you were targeted for any other reasons? You mentioned they were asking about your political background. Do you think that played into it, perhaps?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely it did. I mean, these undercover cops claim that they weren't as an undercover, you know, because there's, I guess there's like 3 tiers of different types of police work that you can do as an intelligence officer. And they kept claiming that as a level 2 undercover officer, they weren't allowed to actually, like, act as infiltrators. However, every time we went to a march, or whenever we went to a party, or even as we were just hanging out, they all wore, you know, black hoodies, black bandanas, and black beanie caps and stuff.
All right. And we know that there's a history of these agent provocateurs, these undercover cops posing as, you know, black bloc anarchists. We got to take our first break tonight, Brian. When we come back, we'll continue where we left off. If you're just joining us, Brian Church, one of the NATO 3, speaks on the Bob Tuscan Show tonight about Homan Square and so much more. Don't go anywhere.
The Bob Tuscan Show.
To their names can be added those of hundreds and thousands of others who stood in the way of the new order. Right now isn't what we're building for.
He wasn't allowed to make contact with anybody. His wrists, as he said in the last segment, were cuffed to a bar behind a bench in a windowless cinder block cell. We're talking with Brian Jacob Church, who was arrested and later known as one of the NATO 3, a protester charged with terrorism. This trumped-up charge to try to, well, appeal to the PR firm behind, well, a number of different politicians that want to continue to perpetuate the notion that after 9/11 we have to be safe in this post 9/11 world, and so on and so forth. Was 9/11 brought up at all in the context of your endeavor, of your experience?
There were a couple of times where, like the symbolism of 9/11 was involved, but that was a trial issue that we actually had to argue about in court. The judge
so it was brought up in trial
to try to go back into the back room so we could argue over that.
So I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but it was brought up in trial to try to frame it under the lens of, post 9/11 world. That was actually a tactic the prosecutors used.
Yeah, it was one of several. I mean, there was one of the things that they were alleging that we were trying to do, which was vandalize a Chase Bank. And what they did was they kind of stood off a mile and took a picture of the big Chase Bank tower in the background, and so it was reminiscent of the Twin Towers.
Interesting. Tell me a little bit more about the trial and how that all went down. The trial's over with now, right? So we can talk about at least the outcome. We might not be able to talk about details, but you can tell the listeners what you were inevitably charged with and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a safe topic.
It's public record. I mean, there are some things that, for those that don't know, that Brian was informed to not talk about for legal reasons and to continue to protect himself. So we want to respect that, Brian, because we support you, man, and we don't want any muddy water here. But what was the result of the trial? That's all public knowledge now. Obviously, you're talking to me not from a jail cell at the moment. Yeah.
So we spent about 3 weeks going through trial. This whole time, I mean, it seemed like a circus to me. I mean, well, I'm not going to get into that, but so the end result was that the jury wasn't buying the stuff that the state attorneys were trying to put against us and say about us, and they didn't really consider us a threat. I mean, they didn't really consider what the state was alleging to be, terrorism in the first place. So what ended up being the result was that all three of us were found not guilty of our terrorism charges, conspiracy and material support for terrorism. But we were, however, found guilty of misdemeanor mob action charges, as well as two counts of possession of the incendiary device, one with intent to commit arson, and the other with knowledge that another had intent to commit arson. And the only reason that we were found guilty of the possession charges is because we were in what's called constructive possession of those Molotov cocktails.
So it was a technicality. We'll be right back with Brian Church.
Show.
Brian, there's no doubt in my mind that we see a militarization of the police force going on, and you talk a little bit in releasing the information that you did about Homan Square, about what you've seen in the complex there in Chicago with these militarized vehicles, and also there was mention of a particular officer that has been investigated that had connections with Guantanamo Bay, which of course is very similar to what many are saying is going on at Homan Square. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Yeah, I didn't actually, I dropped the ball on, doing a little bit of reading on this person who apparently either worked for the people at Guantanamo Bay and then came to Chicago, or he worked in Chicago and then moved to Guantanamo Bay. So I'm I'm not really sure about what his story was.
And essentially, just to back it up here,
there's indulged in plenty of abuses especially as a police officer. Plenty of torture and stuff.
Yeah, let me just jump in here and say that the officer who was in question is Detective Richard Zuley, who is somebody who came from Guantanamo Bay, and there is a definite blurring of lines between domestic law enforcement and military operations. And Tracy Siska, who's a criminologist and civil rights activist in Chicago, said this about him. She said that the real danger is allowing practices like Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib is the fact that they always creep into other aspects. They creep into domestic law enforcement, either with weaponry, like with the militarization of the police, or interrogation practices. That's how we ended up with a black site in Chicago. So that's a kind of an underlying current here in this story, Brian, is this militarization and these tactics that are emulated out of a handbook from Guantanamo, perhaps. Tell me a little bit more about that, though, about the interrogation process. You described being handcuffed for hours at a time. No waterboarding took place, did it?
No, I was definitely fortunate. They didn't do any kind of like physical torture type tactics. It was more along the lines of like sleep deprivation and like mild starvation, and like they wouldn't let us use the bathroom and stuff like that. And of course, it's a pretty big psychological thing when you tell somebody that they can't, after you just arrested them, they can't make a phone call to a lawyer and that nobody knows where you're at. So I mean, like, I was definitely fortunate, and like I had said earlier, like the way they were treating me did not seem typical at all. Not because they didn't allow me access to a lawyer, but because they didn't actually put their hands on me, and they seemed like they were being really restrained.
Interesting. Did your defense team argue that entrapment was a part of their trumped-up charges?
Unfortunately, the way entrapment works, I don't know if it works like that, around the country in other states, but we are facing a state terrorism charge, which is strange in itself, because most terrorism cases go federal. But we weren't allowed to argue entrapment, strictly because in order to argue entrapment, we would have had to actually admit guilt to even as far as saying that we were guilty of conspiring to commit acts of terrorism. And the truth is that we didn't even want to say that, because the reality is that there was no conspiracy to do anything.
So it was in a sense entrapment without any intention of a crime at all.
Yeah. So what they call that is soft entrapment argument, which basically means that we argue for entrapment, but we don't plead not guilty because of entrapment. Unfortunately, our judge was not exactly on our side, and so we weren't even allowed to argue a soft entrapment because our judge had said that that wasn't the issue, and if we were going to argue entrapment, then we had to plead not guilty due to entrapment rather than just pleading innocent completely.
This judge, I'm sure that the judge has a lot of shady dealings. Didn't at first the judge deny a trial by jury?
I don't think so.
Okay.
But I mean, there were some rulings that he did make that we absolutely do not agree with. But I think I'll need to wait until I'm off parole and my other two co-defendants are actually out and about before I speak on that.
Yeah, we want to be careful here. So they're still in jail?
Yes. The three of us, we were given different sentences. I was given 5 years at 50%, and I had spent 2 years in county jail fighting the case, so I got that for good time. And the 50% is what's called statutory good time. So if you get 5 years at 50%, you only have to do 2.5. So I ended up only having to do 6 months in prison plus the 2 years in county jail.
Wow.
Our co-defendant, Brent, got 6 years at 50. And my other co-defendant, Jared Chase, who now goes by Maya, she identifies as a woman now. She got 8 years at 50 and is also fighting another battery case against the police officer in county.
Does she know Bradley Manning? Seems like they have a lot in common.
Bradley Manning, who now goes as Chelsea, and actually
Sure.
Maya has come out with a statement a while back, actually requesting hormone treatment, and he said that if he couldn't get the hormone treatments, that she would go on hunger strike. She actually has had to do that, unfortunately, quite often. She suffers from a pretty severe mental illness, and while we're in county, like sometimes they wouldn't give her the proper medications that she needed, or they wouldn't give her the proper diet that she needed in order to maintain her health.
How did you first meet them? I don't know that I know the backstory.
I'm sorry?
How did you meet these guys and now gals?
Okay, so it was 2011. Occupy Wall Street had started. This was around the time when I actually moved down to Fort Lauderdale from Central Florida in 2010, and
is that when we met briefly?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
But so the next year in September, Occupy Wall Street had started, and as I'm going through my EMT schooling and stuff, I'm still researching these other things. Because I had gotten interested since I had left military school that I was involved in. So I had done my research, and I saw the things that were going on were not the kind of America that I had been led to believe it was when I was in school and stuff.
Sure. Absolutely.
I think his name was Scott Olson. Got shot in the face by a cop with a flashbang grenade or something like that, and nearly killed him. And the guy was a Marine Corps veteran, and he was just standing there. And I watched this video, and it just disgusted me. I was like, I couldn't find the words. I couldn't find the words to describe how I was feeling when I saw that video. And so it was at this point when I watched this video that I was like, all right, well, you know what? Occupy's starting. I'm going to go check out the marches and do what the occupation is all about. The first march I went to, but I didn't go to. I was kind of around, I just watched. I wanted to see how the police were responding to the protesters, just in case. I didn't want to become involved in anything that could have been hazardous to my health. So, I just watched, but the second march came around, and, because the police reacted pretty peacefully towards the protesters, I decided to get involved. And this is where I actually met Brent, because Brent was the first person in Fort Lauderdale to set up a tent in front of City Hall, which is where we slept for about 3 weeks before they finally evicted us.
Actually, that was right when I met you.
Us,
you had just told me about sleeping in front of City Hall, and that's when we first met. I remember that now.
Yeah, and he brought her down to Fort Lauderdale, and we all met up, and we became pretty good friends. We were up there, struggling and trying to expose the injustices, especially going on in Fort Lauderdale, where they'll arrest you for feeding homeless people, which we never got arrested, but we did go out and feed homeless people quite a bit. So, we just got involved with these different types of actions. And that's pretty much how we became friends. So when we found out that the NATO summit was happening in Chicago, I talked to Brent about it, and Brent talked to Maya about it, and we just decided to take a road trip.
So you went up there with the intention of simply protesting and nothing more?
Well, when we talked, we had decided that we were going to be protesting, of course, but if it came down to it, we would be willing to be arrested for, civil disobedience reasons, such as, sitting in front of Bank of America or, blocking traffic or something like that.
So typical civil disobedience, nothing out of the ordinary when it comes to civil disobedience.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. You were breaking up a little bit.
No problem. I'm just trying to point out that this was just your typical civil disobedience that protesters have used for ages and ages.
Right. Yeah. We knew that there was a possibility that we could get arrested for such things. But as far as making Molotov cocktails, and they said that we were gonna go burn down police cars and stuff or whatever. That stuff was not even on our minds at all.
Yeah. Where did they get that from though? Where did they? Did they twist something you did say?
Well, a lot of the things that they brought up in trial and stuff, as far as some of the things that were talked about on recording, most of those types of conversations were brought up and introduced and encouraged by the undercover police officers. Even making the Molotov cocktails, right? We're just sitting around one night where, having a couple of drinks, the undercovers had brought over some alcohol or whatever, and, we were drinking. And it was then when one of the undercover police officers, known as Glove, or Officer Chico, she had said something like, hey, so you guys want to make some Molotov cocktails? And we kind of looked at each other and was like, what? What?
You guys were having a couple of drinks. Maybe he was talking about that kind of cocktail.
I'm sorry, you say that again, please?
You guys were having a few drinks. Maybe he was talking about that kind of cocktail.
Unfortunately, that's what we thought at first, but that didn't turn out to be the case, because they facilitated the making of actual explosives.
So at any point did you say to the guy, what the hell are you doing?
I think I had mentioned before, we as anarchists, we don't believe in putting ourselves in authority over other people. However, we also don't believe in, hurting people or even animals or whatever. We don't believe in property destruction. We don't believe in that stuff. That's typically stuff that the mainstream media pushes out to the population in order to demonize and criminalize people with revolutionary views that actually, when you, do some research and look into it, these things actually make sense.
The Bob Tuscan Show.
Through their ministries of propaganda, each took complete control of the theater, the movies, the radio, every cultural activity and every channel of information.
Well, times is tough, all right. Yeah, I'll say.
It's the future.
What do you want the world to know about Chicago and Homan Square and your case, Brian?
Well, Chicago has a long history of corrupt politicians and violent police officers towards the citizens of this country. And even those who aren't citizens of this country have experienced, brutality at the hands of Chicago PD. However, the city is a really nice city. People are friendly, the food's good, beautiful architecture and stuff. I'd like to see, aside from the cold, of course. I'm a Florida boy. But it needs to be known that my two co-defendants and I never had any intention on creating chaos in this city. We believe in protesting and fighting for freedom in a peaceful manner. And I've especially nowadays I've been adamant on being very clear about my stance on violence, which I don't agree with. But I think it's insanity that these politicians and these state's attorneys and stuff are so willing to try and criminalize dissent that they're going to go as far as calling somebody terrorist. And even the federal government didn't want to prosecute us because they said we weren't a threat and there was no evidence to support terrorism charges. But Anita Alvarez, the state's attorney, the head state's attorney, decided to go through with the charges anyhow, but instead of federal charges, they made it a state charge.
The first charge of its kind.
Yes, that is correct. The first terrorism case the state of Illinois has ever had to deal with was me and my two co-defendants.
Right.
We tried to challenge the constitutionality based on the vague language used in the statute, which it describes the things that police do on a daily basis perfectly.
Interesting.
You know, I mean, there was a couple other things that we challenged.
Yeah. Brian, I want to do this again. I appreciate you giving us the opening interview here, and we will do it. But I want to first encourage you to keep on fighting, not in a violent way, figuratively speaking, against the powers that shouldn't be, and exposing these elements of corruption in our world today. And I want to commend you for your bravery and your honesty. Thanks so much, okay?
All right, thank you. I really appreciate you having me on.
Activism in action. Now go plant some seeds.